optimistic. Myron Orfield is a graduate of the University of Minnesota, and he did graduate work at Princeton. He has a law degree from the University of Chicago Law School, and he has been an assistant attorney general of Minnesota. He now serves as an adjunct professor of law at the University of Minnesota Law School. He is a 4-term member of the House of Representatives in Minnesota. His special area of expertise has led to national recognition in metropolitan planning and policy making. He is the director of the Metropolitan Area Program, a program of the American Land Institute. He has done or is doing studies of regional polarization in 14 metropolitan areas. He's just completed a book, Metropolitics, a regional agenda for the community and stability. He's been most recently appointed to a National Academy of Sciences committee on improving the future of United States cities, and he's also been appointed to the Policy Council of the Association of Public Policy Analysis and Management. Wow. Dr. Manuel Pastor, Jr., is our second speaker, and he is the chair of Latin American and Latino Studies at Merrill College at UC Santa Cruz. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and his research has focused on urban issues, especially as they link regional economic issues and community development. His research funding has been supported by the National Science Foundation and by the MacArthur, the Rockefeller, the Ford, and the Irvine Foundations, and he has received Danforth, Guggenheim, Kellogg, and Fulbright fellowships, who's who of funding in America. He has published unusually widely, and he's always focusing on ways in which strategies can be developed to address poverty, and that in such a way that it can benefit the entire economy of metropolitan areas. One of his titles which most intrigued me was Keeping Down with the Joneses, Neighbors, Networks, and Wages, which he wrote in 1995 with Anna Adams. He's also studied the geographic location of toxic wastes in Los Angeles County with Jim Sadd, and this resulted in a 1996 publication, Is There Environmental Racism? In addition to lots of national speaking engagements and international speaking engagements, Dr. Pastor has served as a consultant to many California cities to assist them in developing economic strategies for poor neighborhoods. Today, these particularly well-qualified men bring their special areas of expertise to bear as they examine Portland with us from their own particular perspectives. Myron Orfield will speak first, followed by Dr. Pastor. I'd be grateful if you'd welcome them both at this time.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the City Club for inviting me, and also the Coalition for a Livable Future for sponsoring the work that I've done here in Portland. I come from a mid-sized region in the country, a region with a progressive regional government, a system of land use planning, not quite as extensive as yours, but extensive, a system of fiscal equity. And for a long time, our region, Minneapolis and St. Paul, believed that we were immune from the urban problems that had brought down older, larger metropolitan cities. We had a progressive society, we had a progressive legislature, we were working strongly on these issues, we had a strong, dedicated philanthropic community, but suddenly these problems hit us very hard in the 1980s. They almost overtook us. We saw poverty concentrate in our core city for the first time, growing racial segregation, a concentration of poverty in schools. An area in the city began to grow isolated from the rest of the metropolitan economy, high rates of joblessness, high rates of crime in those areas. At the same time, the social needs were rapidly increasing in this area. The tax base that underlay local services was not advancing sufficiently to keep up with the demand for social services. These problems didn't stop neatly at the central cities. Many of our older suburbs became involved too. As poverty crossed into older suburbs with lower tax values, it tended to intensify and concentrate. The patterns as they moved into the inner suburbs grew faster and more rapid. At the same time, we were beginning to support a series of suburbs developing at the edge that were drawing off a lot of the region's growth and economic productivity. They were drawing off the most expensive homes in the regions, the most expensive commercial industrial property. And at the same time, their poverty rates were comparatively low and declining. The region began to polarize, and it began to put the older part of the region with rapidly increasing social and economic needs at a distinct disadvantage in competing for middle-class homes and businesses with a newer part of the region that was drawing off all the benefits of regional citizenship but accepting fewer and fewer of the responsibilities. We began to study what was happening to us in the Twin Cities, and it led to formations and new coalitions in our legislature. It led to stronger legislation. It led to strengthening our regional government's powers and duties. It led to stronger land use laws and coordination of land use and infrastructure. It led to a regional fair housing law. It led to a whole variety of new measures in the legislature, and I think the coalitions that we've set in place in Minnesota are putting us on a path to begin to deal with these problems. A couple of years ago, the Coalition for a Livable Future asked me to collect some of the data that we'd collected in Minnesota to see whether some of these same trends were true in the Portland region, a region particularly well equipped to start to think about this, given that it also has a regional government. It also has a very extensive system of land use planning. I'm going to talk about some of my findings. And what I'm going to tell you is I think the same basic trends that affected us, that almost overtook us in the 80s, are present here. That they are, in a way, there is something that is urgent and that you should begin to look at. There is something that you shouldn't suffer the same problem that we did. Don't be too sure of yourselves in terms of these trends, because they can happen fairly rapidly. The first trend that we took a look at was the growth of concentrated poverty. Concentrated poverty is a thing that's happening in all American cities. Census tracts with more than 20% of the people in poverty, census tracts with more than 40% of the people in poverty. In American regions, in the last 20 years, the poverty rate across American regions has only grown about 1%. But the deep distressed neighborhoods, the neighborhoods of concentrated poverty in America, have more than doubled. In Portland in 1980, you had 21 tracts that were in the range between 20 and 40% of the people in poverty. By 1990, you had 38, which is a fairly significant growth. An area of concentrated poverty began to grow in the city. You also have, for a region that's very white, that's very non-diverse racially, a growing concentration of segregation in the older central city schools. Schools like Woodland and the Portland School District, in a region that's less than 3% African American. Schools that are almost 80% African American, 79.6. Vernon at 71.5. King at 71.1. Sabine at 62.3. Concentration of poverty and racial segregation go hand in hand with the deep maladies that have happened in central city areas. They can overtake a community very rapidly. Many of the older communities in the region had very low levels and very quickly advanced. As regions grow, they will become more racially diverse. All the regions in the country will be. And a region that has begun to set up and begun to accept this diversity in the poorest neighborhoods of the central cities by concentrating poverty and creating racial segregation is creating a tinderbox that can lead to the same maladies that have brought down older, larger regions. These problems are not confined to just the central city areas. Social need is growing in many of the older suburban communities as well. In terms of free and reduced cost lunch statistics across the Portland metropolitan area, free and reduced cost lunch measures social need in students. It measures, free and reduced lunch goes to students that are at low income levels, that qualify for assistance and receive aid in terms of their lunch. The Portland School District had 45% of its children qualify for free and reduced cost lunch. And between 1990 and 97, it increased steadily. It increased at 3.5% over that period. In 1980, the Minneapolis School District had 28% of its children qualifying for free and reduced lunch. Now it has 60. Well, the real story about what happened in the 1990s about free and reduced lunch wasn't in the central city of Portland, though. It was in the older suburban districts and also some of the other districts of the city. David Douglas in the eastern part of the city moved to 13%, moved to 44.2%. So in 6 years, increased by 13.3%. The Forest Grove School District out in the northwest edge of the region grew 11 points to 43.3%. The Reynolds District moved 16 percentage points up to 40.8%. Centennial School District moved up 11 points to 40.2%. Or that's the Park Rose District, moved up 11 points to 40.2%. Centennial moved up 8.8 to 30.6. And the Gresham Barlow District 5.5 points from 15 to 21%. In the regions of the country that we've studied, these are steep increases. These are rapid increases, districts that are changing this fast. Social needs are growing more rapidly in some of the older districts of the region. And schools are a very important prophecy for cities. In one sense, the school children are going to become the adults in the community, and as a higher and higher share of students have social needs, they have a higher and higher share of students that are going to have trouble finishing school, moving on to other productive outcomes in terms of their lives. They are also a prophecy because when concentration of poverty grows in school districts, middle-class families that have residential choices tend to opt out of those districts. They tend to move to the districts that have the lowest poverty levels that they can afford. So as poverty is growing in the older districts, you have a warning sign. There's a shot across your bow that you should think about. In every other region of the country that we've studied, when we've started to see numbers rising like this is something that communities should think seriously about. We also took a look at things like median household income and childhood poverty and the percentage of female-headed households in the region. Portland, by 1980, had 21% of its children below the federal poverty line, which is even more severe poverty than free and reduced cost lunch. To qualify for free and reduced cost lunch, a family earns between $12,000 and $13,000. Childhood poverty, the threshold is $8,400. So that children are not poor by federal standards unless they live in homes, single mothers with a single child in homes of less than $8,400. By 1980, 21% of the children in Portland were below that federal poverty line. But in communities like Fairview, the number was 27.1. In Forest Grove, 22.5. In Milwaukee, 18.3. Sherwood, 16.9. Oregon City, 15.2, high and increasing. In many of these older communities, the rates were increasing faster than the central cities. And these were the communities that had the lowest tax base per household. If you take a look at what's going on in terms of growth of the region, I think that you have a very impressive picture here in the region. You have a lot of growth here, and property values are going up dramatically. It is a boom place here, and almost everywhere in the region you're seeing property values rise. But at the end of the decade, those communities where the highest social need exists, in the cities and the older suburbs, the property tax bases remain the lowest. In many of these communities that were growing in the lower tax base category, you find impressive growth, and you find extremely fine management of those cities. Cities that are dedicated to improving the fiscal situation of their communities, cities that are doing everything that they can to do that and are doing an excellent job. Some of the cities here I think are doing as well as any place else in the nation. I know that the city of Gresham has got an extremely fine plan for growth and has done an extraordinary job in turning around a situation that is somewhat difficult in terms of fiscal capacity. At the end of the day, though, the communities that have the high social need, the communities that have the Reynolds School District and the Gresham-Barlow School District and the Forest Grove School District, they meet their challenges with the lowest assessed value in the region. Portland at 1996 had $143,756 of assessed value per household. That was the assessed value on its rolls per household. Fairview at $106,000. Cornelius at $112,000, Gresham at $141,000, Forest Grove at $125,000, Milwaukee at $145,000. On the other hand, in the rapidly growing communities like Wilsonville at $284,000, Happy Valley at $283,000, Lake Oswego at $123,000, West Lynn at $213,000, Tigard at $207,000, there is quite a disparity. The communities that have the highest social need in this region, the community where the social need is growing the greatest, have the smallest assessed value per household. The areas that are growing the fastest, the areas that have the largest bases, are having impressive growth. If you look at Portland growing at 39% or Cornelius growing at 41%, you take a look on the other hand at Happy Valley at twice the tax base growing at 97% or West Lynn growing at 67%. What does that mean in the long run? It means that the structural dynamics that draw regions apart are present here. The concentration of poverty is present here, and it's growing in the central cities. The places where social needs are collecting have the most limited resources. The places of enormous growth and economic needs have the fewest social needs. What does that mean when communities in the region compete for tax base, compete for prosperity, compete for middle-class families? Communities that have a large assessed value and a comparatively low social need can say, businesses, please come here. The poverty rate is low. The tax base is high. We can offer comparatively low taxes and comparatively high levels of municipal services. On the other hand, those communities that have a small tax base, no matter how brilliantly they're run, no matter how they straighten up the ship of state, no matter how well they do, they still compete from the disadvantage of having a low assessed value base and a high level of social need. These forces have a tendency, if they're let go, to pull regions apart, cause the places with the older need, the older resources, the older infrastructure, the greater need to become magnets for the social and economic needs of the region, while the places that have the highest tax bases and the lowest social needs become magnets for the highest economic growth. If you look at job growth throughout the region, again, it's been impressive. But the older suburban communities in the central cities are growing in the rate of 40 to between 0% and 40%. Many of the newer communities with the highest tax base, communities like Tigard and Wilsonville, Lake Oswego, and Tualatin are growing at 123, 119, 73, 86%. The patterns are here in place. The patterns, the things that have divided older, larger regions are here in place, and they are growing, even in a time of tremendous economic prosperity. This isn't to say that you're not doing things well. This isn't to say that this place looks better than the rest of the country. It does. But these trends happen rapidly. They happen rapidly in Minneapolis. They happen rapidly in St. Paul. They happen rapidly a generation or before in Milwaukee. And once they start, once they get out of hand, they can become tremendously enervating. What can you do to increase your situation in terms of dealing with this? There's several things. Several of the things that you probably uniquely in the country are set up to do with a strong elected regional government and a system of land use laws that are far-reaching and thoughtful. Work on ending fiscal disparities between communities. Work on reducing the disparity between communities and their tax base so that communities can have greater equity in the provision of services. We have a law in Minnesota called the Fiscal Disparities Act that shares tax base among communities in the metropolitan region. And since 1971, we've shared 40% of the growth of our commercial industrial tax base among the 187 cities, 7 counties, and 49 school districts of our metropolitan area. It's reduced disparities in cities above 1,000 from 12 to 1 to 4 to 1. It's kept tax rates closer. It's kept service rates closer. It's allowed older suburban communities to be able to compete with lower tax rates and better services in terms of attracting businesses and maintaining stability. Create stronger regional fair housing laws. You have a system in place that's the envy of many places in the nation. You have reduced barriers to affordable housing. Your developing edge is developing with a broader diversity of housing than most places in the country. But it's still, many communities there isn't a great deal of affordable housing, and there isn't housing involved at the lowest levels of income. The places that are creating jobs do not have sufficient affordable housing for the people that need jobs. And increasingly, the low-valued communities are becoming the homes of workers at low-wage jobs, and high-valued communities are becoming the places where those jobs exist. If a place wants to create low-value jobs, it should be able to provide housing for those people. Housing for people at the lowest levels should not be left on the tax bases of the older and more stressed-out communities that are coping with their own social and economic needs. Concentration of poverty is comparatively small here, and it shouldn't be allowed to continue. The pattern of growing distressed neighborhoods in the core should be stopped, and a regional fair housing plan with everyone having their fair share of affordable housing can prevent that from happening. We should also, in terms of dealing with the regional affordable housing problem, try to deal with the problems of rapid gentrification, try to deal with some of the problems of displacement in all urban neighborhoods. Hopefully, in the end of the day, all urban neighborhoods should have affordable housing, all suburban neighborhoods should have affordable housing. The older communities shouldn't bear up under all of the weight of those issues. Increase regional support for transit policies with a priority of getting individuals to work. In the short term, if the jobs are going to be created, particularly to the southern and western part of the region, try to emphasize, in terms of regional transportation, getting people without jobs to the jobs that are going unfilled at the outer edge of the metropolitan area. These are the types of things that I think that you can do to avoid these trends. These trends are real, though. When you take a look at a region that has 3% of its children African American, and the poorest schools in the central cities are 70%, where the percentage of poor children and minority children is growing in those areas of concentrated poverty and in the perimeter of those areas, where the older and low tax-based communities are seeing the most dramatic need in terms of poverty, in terms of their schools, where growth is being concentrated in a particular part of the region where social needs are low and tax base is very high. You have all the ingredients that have drawn apart older, larger regions. On the upside, I think you have a progressive system. You've dealt with difficult problems before, and in many of the ways that you're dealing with transportation and land use planning, you are leading the nation. Take these problems seriously. We are paying the price now when we let these problems slip by us. Don't let poverty concentrate. Don't let fiscal disparities grow. Fiscal disparities, if they come out of hand, will pull apart the efforts that you've done in terms of land use planning. Concentrated poverty will pull apart all of the good efforts toward urban regentrification and urban renewal that have occurred in the region. Thank you very much for having me here, and I'd be happy to answer questions when the time arises for my session to be over.
I come from California, and I do not intend to move here. I come, in fact, from the tinderbox that Myron mentioned. While I live in Santa Cruz right now, and I know there's an alum in the audience, I spent the last 14 years living in Los Angeles, where the spark on the tinderbox was lit. And we saw the consequences of not dealing with the issues of concentrated poverty, inequality, and poverty in a region. And we saw that it dragged down the whole region. I spent a little time this morning with members of the Coalition for a Livable Future. I want to thank them. I think many of them are in the cheap seats in the back. And I want to thank both them and the City Club for having both Myron and I here today. In that meeting, for some reason, we began talking about the Boy Scouts. And Christopher Juniper, who is doing economic development for the city of Portland, mentioned that when he was in the Boy Scouts, that he remembered that one of the sayings was, "You cannot hike any faster than the last person in the troop." And that's one of the clear messages I want to convey to you today, that poverty is a drag on your region. The poor are not. They are assets and can be incorporated into regional development. I wasn't in the Boy Scouts myself, but not to be outdone by Boy Scout quotes, I replied to Christopher that as far as I knew, at least from watching, I think, Ozzie and Harriet on TV, that another Boy Scout quote was, "Be prepared." And that's the second message for today. It is easy to be happy and pleased when you live in a place as beautiful as Portland and you witness the downtown revitalization and all the tremendous successes you have, but the problems that Myron is talking about are ones that can snap you later. And they're ones that you should begin working on now. When I was asked to come here, the question that was posed to me was, can the problems of urban decay happen here in Portland? And the answer is, they can, they are, and you should do something about them. Now, that would end my speech too quickly. So let me instead go on to some other questions I made up for myself, which is, why should you care? Why should you care about this problem? That is, why should you think about the problem of poverty and inequality at a regional level? And there are two answers I want to give. For those of you who are regional leaders, you need to know that regions grow faster when you do something about poverty and inequality, and I'll talk about that research. And for those of you who are concerned about social justice issues in the poor, you need to know that poverty will not be solved unless it is solved in a regional context, and I'll expand that. And the second point I want to make today really is that it can be done. This is, yeah, I'm an academic, and I know academics sometimes get up and say great things that really nothing could come from it, right? I'm not that good of an academic, I guess. I don't think I should put out ideas unless there's something that can be done, and in Portland you're situated, I think, to do something about it. So first set of questions, why should you begin tackling this at a regional level? Well, it turns out that regions grow faster and better when they tackle poverty, and sensitive to the issues of Portland, let me point out that by faster I mean increases in per capita income, not simply many Californians moving to join you here. That is rather, when we look at per capita income and inequality, we find a relationship which I think may be a bit surprising. There's a number of studies that began to establish this sometime about 3 or 4 years ago, the Liederberg and Barnes studies and numbers from the National Civic League. These previous studies looked at city-suburban disparity and regional per capita income growth and found that the two things went hand in hand. Of course, there's a problem with that, as any of you who have done any economics know, which is that there's a problem of simultaneity, which is that it could be that simply if a region grows more rapidly, it brings more people out of poverty. You don't know what's going on here in terms of the causation. When I first began work on a project looking at regional development in Los Angeles, a project called Growing Together, Linking Regional and Community Development, We were worried about that problem of correlation, but of course economists have dealt with problems of correlation for a long time, because we know that investment may promote economic growth, but also economic growth by expanding the market promotes investment. So there's simultaneity, causal relationships going both ways. So we looked at 74 different metropolitan regions in the United States and redid the research. We controlled for the other variables that determine poverty and the other variables that determine per capita income, per person income in a region. And we found out that even controlling for the fact that growth itself will reduce the poverty rate, those regions that tackle central city poverty, those regions that reduce city-suburban disparities, grow faster. Why? Because regions are built on social trust and human assets. The region has emerged as the fundamental economic unit in the world economy. As international barriers have fallen, the competitive units in the world economy are not the United States or Japan. They're Silicon Valley, Monterrey, Mexico, the Northern Italian Industrial District. They are regions. Why regions? Well, they're large enough to get the economies of scale you need to produce for an international market. But they're small enough to have face-to-face relationships amongst the key economic actors. People can come together as they do in this room, talk to each other, build trust, build relationships, build a regional strategy, and move forward. When you have lots of poverty and inequality, you cannot build those kind of partnerships. You cannot do effective planning. When you have lots of poverty and inequality, you don't get the human capital that makes regions grow forward. So first point really is, those of you who are mostly concerned about the region should very much be concerned about the issues of disparity and inequality and poverty. The second point is those of you, probably many in the back, who are maybe even more concerned about issues of poverty, must realize that poverty reduction works better when it's connected to the region. The problem of poor neighborhoods is a problem of suffering from three different things: drought, leakage, and isolation. Drought is a lack of investment in neighborhoods. Leakage is a lack of retail. Anybody who works, brings their money home, finds that in poorer neighborhoods there isn't the shopping, the retail, that also builds neighborhood fabric and community life. And isolation is the lack of connections. The lack of connections to where jobs are, the lack of connections to political power. And isolation reinforces the other two problems of drought and leakage. That's the issue of concentrated poverty. And in recent years, the folks who've been paying the most attention to the issues of concentrated poverty are community development corporations, and I'm sure that you have many fine ones here. But community development corporations are increasingly realizing, as they try to do community development, that they are generally not operating at a large enough scale to make a big impact, and that it is more difficult to bring dynamic sectors to places than it is to take people who live in those places and connect them to the dynamic sectors of the regional economy. What does this mean? In terms of tackling the issues of poverty, people who do community development are beginning to realize that we need to couple two things together. One is what we've called place-based development. That's sort of the traditional issues of building affordable housing, of doing the sorts of neighborhood retail, et cetera, building a place. But often that doesn't generate many jobs. I mean, affordable housing, there's some construction jobs, people won't necessarily get them. Retail doesn't generate high-wage jobs. Place-based development is about making neighborhoods livable, so that when people become economically successful, they do not move out of them, but stay there and restore a sense of connection, a lack of isolation, a social fabric to poor neighborhoods. But we also need to be thinking about what people in this profession call people-based development, which is connecting residents to jobs and opportunities wherever they might exist in a region. I like the fact that you quoted that title. I try to think of good titles for projects, and that was a great project. We did a project looking at wages in Los Angeles called Keeping Down with the Joneses, Neighbors, Networks, and Wages. And what we did was we looked at individuals in poor neighborhoods and tried to find out what was the impact on those individuals of living in the poor neighborhoods, controlling for their education levels, their skill levels, their age, their immigrant status, their ethnic group, their English language skills. Somebody who moved from a largely very, very poor neighborhood, Compton, to a more middle-class neighborhood, Glendale, would immediately find their wages increased by 15%. Well, why? Because networks matter. If you live in a poor neighborhood, everybody else around you poor. They either have no job or bad jobs, and they're not connected to the good jobs in the economy. And if you move to someplace, if you begin to do this sort of residential deconcentration, you begin to see increases in networks and connections. I mean, how did you get your jobs? Through networks? I think so. And poorer people often lack the kind of networks that really connect them to housing, to these kind of income opportunities. Now, it turns out our study, which predicts a 15% increase in income, is almost exactly equal to the increase in income gained by those individuals who were involved in the Gautreaux housing experiment in Chicago, in which they were given vouchers to move out of public housing into suburban neighborhoods. By moving into the suburban neighborhoods, their kids got in better schools. They became part of networks of people who were working and were able to do better economically. So mobility is important, and connections to outside the community are important. It's not to dissuade people. We need to continue to do place-based development to make neighborhoods livable so that when people do become successful, they might choose to stay. What are the policies here? Policies of housing mobility, giving people an opportunity to move where they need to. This suggests that part of what Portland is considering, making sure that affordable housing is scattered throughout the region, is important, that inclusionary zoning is important. Another policy implication is that job and employment connections are important, that it's important to link people to the economic opportunities wherever they might exist, and to have linkage strategies which do that. Now, on this topic, I think it's important to note something which is important in Portland with your community of poor. There's a very important book that was just completed last year by William Julius Wilson, who's probably the country's leading urban sociologist. The book is called When Work Disappears. And when it was published, somebody handed it to me and said, "This is the new Bible." And in some sense, for urban sociologists, it is, and William Julius Wilson is the Pope. And what Wilson argues in this book is that what's important about work is not just the income it generates, but the integrating function that it serves in people's lives. It connects them to the larger society. It creates a regularity around time. It creates a social fabric. It creates a neighborhood environment in which the habits of work become the habits imparted to young people, making it easier for them to connect to employment in the future. He argues that one of the big things in these neighborhoods of concentrated poverty is that work has disappeared, and with it, some important element of social fabric. I'm planning on writing another book, which will be called When Wages Disappear. Many of the people who are poor, particularly in the Latino community, in Portland and elsewhere, are in fact working and still poor. And today's working poor are tomorrow's underclass. Because when people work hard every day and they still can't make enough to bring their families out of poverty, then frustrations develop around work. This should, recognizing the role of the working poor, fundamentally alter the nature of job training that we do. There's a lot more need for retraining and moving people up the ladders. And it also should change the way we approach these issues in general. Well, I think I've challenged regional leaders to pay attention to the poor. In some sense, this is a challenge to those who deal with the issues of social justice and community development, that you need to move beyond the prism of the neighborhood and connect up to the region. It is in the region that the economy is generated, the opportunities are there. Can it be done? It's being done elsewhere in the country. We did an interesting part of our study where we were trying to find out where best practices were in the rest of the country. And I'd read a study that was done by Ned Hill from Cleveland State, and he did a a study where he asked people, he asked urban experts like myself what they thought were urban success stories over the 1980s. And then he went out and looked at the data and measured urban success by income generation, unemployment reduction, poverty reduction, those kind of things. And it turned out there was a disparity between what the experts thought was successful and what the data told us was successful. And it's an interesting disparity. When I looked at it more carefully, it seemed that urban experts seemed to identify places that had lots of cappuccino bars as being successful. But they didn't necessarily do that well on these measures that might be important. So what we did was we put together something called the Growing Together Index, which looked at regional per capita income. It looked at the reduction in central city poverty, and it looked at residential deconcentration of the poor, because to the extent that people are integrated across a region, they know each other a little bit more, and they might be more prone at a leadership level to do something about poverty. And in that ranking, for 74 different metro regions, Portland is 31. That's not very good. It's not very good. There are lots of cappuccino bars, and many people are doing well. But there is a need to bring forth these kind of issues and to pay attention to the kinds of arguments that Myron is making with this report. What needs to be done then to couple regional development, regional strategies, and anti-poverty strategies, or to couple together regional and community development? First, it needs leadership. And the leadership has to come from the business sector, public officials, and the media. I noticed before coming here the article about how the extension of your transportation system was going to lead to lots of Latino gangs coming on and sort of making the transportation system not work. What a great story. How well do you know each other? How well does the media contribute to you getting to know one another at a real level and understanding the positive things that are going on in people's communities, at understanding that you are each other's neighbors? How committed is business? In Charlotte, North Carolina, business has had a tremendous commitment to working in inner city neighborhoods and bringing poverty onto the top of the agenda. Business in that area is proud of the fact that they were able to do school desegregation without violence. Do we have leadership here? You need community pressure. Communities need to be organized. You need an entirely new framework of thinking about both regional development and community development. You need the kind of formal structures that you do have, such as the Metro Council, but you also need informal structures. The places where this is working are where it's not just government leading, but it's a partnership between government and business. It's often business-led, and community groups. And community groups, those of you in the cheap seats, need to remember that you ought to be invited to the table, and that if you're not invited to the table, like any good community organizer, you should stand outside and make sure that you do get invited to the tables of discussion about where the region is heading. Now, in this task, you have great assets. You're not doing that badly, as Myron said. There's some trouble signs. You've got, I think, a significant amount of leadership on these issues. I'm deeply impressed by much of what's going on here. As I shared this morning, I'm actually deeply impressed by the Coalition for a Livable Future, in part because it's one of the few regional efforts that's gone beyond looking at environmental issues and recognizing that dealing with poverty is part of social sustainability, just like dealing with the environment is part of natural sustainability. Can you do it? Well, you come from a place where the slogan is supposed to be "Just do it," right? So I think you can. In appealing to Los Angeles to do this, we pointed out that in the charts that we used, that Los Angeles seemed to be the best of the worst cities. You're not that bad, but your civic pride is at stake. But there's a deeper reason to do this as well, and that's what I want to end on. Myron and I talked before coming here, and I realized that Myron was instructed not to talk about tax-based sharing because that's somehow a word that's not used here, tax-based. And so he talked about assessed value. And I thought about the term value sharing. And when I thought about value sharing, I realized it went far beyond taxes. And it went to central and basic human values that we share or can share. People across the United States are tired of the fragmentation they feel by class, by race, and by geography. They know there's something wrong when this many kids need to have a free lunch. They know there's something wrong when children don't have the chances that they should. People all over may suffer from the pains of poverty, but those not in poverty feel a deep loss at the pain of social disconnection. And there's a longing in many of the regions I visit, and I'm sure in the regions that you visit, Myron, a longing to reverse sprawl, to restore a sense of space and of social fabric. We are, in short, tired of growing apart. We ought to pick up the challenge of growing together. Thank you.
Thank you for those presentations. You've left me with about confused because I've got so many questions to raise. I got to stick, however, to a simple one or two. You've pointed out problems. We have to address those problems, not a regional tax sharing plan, but we have two programs, both of which to some degree are under attack right now. And I want to ask you whether you've taken these into account and what you think the effect would be on the problems you're talking about. One is the state has a strategic investment program to bring new jobs, new investments to areas that need them. I mean, so that's bringing jobs to people where they need them. The other program, particularly right here in the metropolitan area, is a transportation plan. And I'm beating Ray Polani to the punch on this one. The program is light rail. We've done it from the central core of the city to the east side. Next year, it's going to open up from the core of the city to the west side. We're in a big argument as to whether to extend light rail north and south. But the effect of doing what you're talking about is that that light rail permits people to stay in the core city and to get jobs in the area where they're growing fastest, in the high-tech jobs in the suburbs. I just came back from Minneapolis, and I didn't see that kind of transportation program there, Myron. But I want to know, from your point of view, when we complete these programs and as we carry them forward, will they address to a large degree the problems you're talking about for Portland metropolitan area?
Yes. I think I'll go first. We looked particularly at where jobs were being developed and where people that needed jobs were. And there was strong job growth throughout the region. The communities with a lower assessed value, the communities that had a higher level of social need, were growing somewhere between 0% and 30 or 40% in terms of jobs per household between 1980 and 94. The real massive expanse of jobs in places that were at the outer edge, the high tax base communities that often had as many as 119 or 123 jobs per household compared to 45 or 25 or so in the core, they were growing at twice that rate. So there is some good things. There are some jobs happening where people need jobs in Portland and in the older suburbs. The explosion of jobs, however, the real explosion of jobs is in the high tax base communities at the edge of the metropolitan area. In terms of transit, I think that the light rail system is a very good thing, and I wish that we had it in the Twin Cities. I wish we had a light rail system. I think that's an excellent thing, and I think it will help get people to jobs, and I think that's an important thing to get people to jobs. If you have jobs at the edge in a community that are going unfilled and you have people that need them, and you have a transit system that will deliver that, that's excellent. I think that's particularly good in a short-term strategy, but in the longer term, you have to think about whether you want to create a community where the workers live in certain communities and the businesses are in others. And do you want to create a community where all the tax base goes to communities that don't have to provide affordable housing for workers, and all the affordable housing is clustered in communities that don't have a lot of resources? I think that's the larger question, and I think that's the more important one. But I do think your light rail system is excellent.
Let me start with the light rail issue. I, as I mentioned, come from Los Angeles, where when we put in a light rail system, we managed to both have a lot of accidents, but also send initially lots of trains in from the suburbs to the central city, but no trains out in the morning to the suburbs, until some of us pointed out that maybe some of the low-income people living in the central city could take on some of the service jobs that were emerging in the suburbs. So now I'm proud to say Los Angeles runs, I think, 2 trains each morning out to the suburbs and has the most overcrowded bus system in the United States. The caution with what you're doing with light rail is just to make sure that those kind of issues are considered. I hope that they are, and they probably are, but there is a tendency to think, because you have a lot of downtown employment, and I think an unusually high percentage, if I'm right, of downtown employment relative to other cities, to think about light rail as a connector to the downtown and not to remember about the reverse side of it, particularly for these entry-level jobs. I do want to say that I think that I understand what you're saying, Myron, and agree with it in some ways about worrying about workers working in one area and living in another. And I'm probably the only, right now I live 5 minutes away from where I work, and that's a longer commute than I had in Los Angeles, where I lived within walking distance, making me, I think, one of 3 people in the LA Basin. But poor people should have the same right and choice to work wherever they want in the region. And one of the things that we do when we do this community development stuff is thinking about bringing jobs to a place rather than connecting residents to the jobs wherever they exist. I may be stressing that too much because in the long run I actually do believe in balanced communities, the need to respect the ecosystem, living and working in the same place. But I think so often we've thought about just bringing jobs in and not about connecting residents to the part of the labor market and thinking about anti-poverty strategies in a regional context. So maybe it's a little too much emphasis on that, but I would add that to what you said.
Jim Francisconi, City Club member. Before my question, I'd like to, that statistic about 21% of Portland's children below the poverty line, 83% of those children are children of color. 83% of the 21%. Just to add some to your point, Myron. My question is on city-county consolidation. The mayor of Philadelphia recently told me that he felt that consolidating the city and the county in the early 70s led to the concentration of poverty in Philadelphia and making it more difficult to get out of that when you have the same geographical boundaries. Can you comment on whether city-county consolidation has been an effective tool and what effect it's had nationally? And does it act as a barrier sometimes to these regional solutions that you've been addressing?
Yes. In Philadelphia, the city was consolidated with a county which was coterminous with the city limits. So the city county had the same limits as the city of Philadelphia. It would be like as if Portland became a county and a city all by itself, and all the county needs were based on the city's tax base, and all the city needs were too. So that was a particularly unfortunate decision, I think, and I think the mayor was right in the sense that it not only, in some places, urban social needs that a central city has are shared with the surrounding county, and some of the surrounding county is more affluent than the city. In Philadelphia, they really closed that down. On the other hand, in Indianapolis and Marion County, the city consolidated with all of its suburbs into one county. Nashville-Davidson, the same thing. And that created a big fiscal benefit for the city. In the Twin Cities, our form of regionalism has never involved consolidation. We've never consolidated a unit of government ever. And we have lots of cities and lots of counties and school districts. We've tried to work on creating more equity between the existing units of government. That's been the way that we've gone about it. Other places have done it differently. That's a little bit foreign to our experience, the consolidation. If the consolidation is broad enough and involves enough tax base and enough of the suburban area, it creates fiscal equity and it lifts the cities and the older, lower tax base communities up. But in Philadelphia, they just consolidated all the county responsibilities on an old city's tax base, and that was a bad decision.
I wanted to add to that much of what can happen economically in terms of the strategy for a region need not rely on formal mechanisms and formal structures, but can also emerge out of informal alliances, sometimes connected to formal things. The example I think about in that regard, and there are numerous around the country, is joint venture Silicon Valley in, unsurprisingly, the Silicon Valley, which is a business-led, but it sort of became a business-government partnership to do regional planning in that area. They've gotten 27 cities across 2 different counties to agree to a uniform building code, and then to have inspectors sit down and meet to agree to interpret that code. Well, why? Because it allows them to put up plants quicker, because they know what the rules are, right? And it got the cities to stop competing with one another and think about themselves as a regional entity attracting business, and it turned out to have a very positive thing. That's not a formal structure, and I think particularly around economic issues, a lot of what we're seeing happening won't necessarily happen through formal structures, but also through some informal structures and these kinds of civic alliances.
Robert Liberty, City Club and Coalition member. I want to ask Myron a question about tax-based sharing. A number of people have said in the past after your presentations that the ideas are stimulating, but you don't really understand Measure 5 and 47 and Measure 50. And of course, I know everyone in this room does. And you've been working on this for 2 years now. Do you think that Measures 5, 47, and 50 change the analysis and mean that proposal tax-based sharing really isn't going to work here or have the same relevance?
Well, I think that we don't have those kinds of limitations in Minnesota. We don't have the limitation of receipts or rate caps or assessed value caps or anything like that. And these are complicated measures. And we've simulated in the study, we simulated the tax-based sharing under Measures 5 and 47, not under 50, which recently passed. I don't think these serve as barriers to property tax-based sharing. But I think that if there's some doubt about it, people that are interested should have Metro do the tax-based sharing analysis. They should have Metro take the numbers and run them. I don't believe that these measures, I think they add some wrinkles to it and change the outcomes. I think in some cases they may force tax rates down more than they improve service levels and things like that, but I think generally they'll be beneficial. I think the same basic dynamic is occurring here as is occurring in the rest of the country. The places that have high social needs have a comparatively low tax base. They have comparatively high municipal rates and are able to offer comparatively low municipal services. And that's not because these communities are poorly run. I think some of the low tax-based communities in this region have some of the finest local government officials in the nation. The problem is when you have a low tax base and a high social need, you have high taxes and low services. That's all there is to it. I don't think that these measures would interfere with tax-based sharing, but if you have any doubts, you should have Metro run the numbers. I think they can do it in an afternoon, and they can show you that tax-based sharing will improve services and reduce taxes in at least 3/4 of the region.
I'm Ray Polani, a City Club member. Talking about disparity in treatment, regional disparity in treatment, I would like to ask your opinion. In the city, recently we have expanded parking in the core. And of course, it's expensive parking in the sense that we charge for it. On the other hand, all around the city, in suburbia, there is plenty of so-called free parking available. Do you think that perhaps a proper approach would not be to expand paid parking in the inner city, but rather restrict and charge for parking in the outlying area?
Well, I come from California where parking is a human right. I think that's a challenging issue, and of course part of the charges for parking have to do with what you're trying to do with your transportation system and traffic control and how many cars you want to have down here.
I think I would agree with Manuel on that point.
Walt Roberts, a City Club member. Manuel, your comments about the formal structures and the informal structures that can arise, and your comments about the media and what's really getting covered there, and what, is the media helping us know about each other. I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about how you see that relationship playing between the formal structures. For example, we have Metro here, and I've been curious about if we're happy and somewhat complacent and somewhat disconnected, and we have this regional government, then it's sort of like we don't have to get together informally to do some stuff that we would naturally do if we knew that there were needs that we could help, do something about. So what's been happening in other similar regions? What do you see about our situation in that relationship?
Well, I certainly hope Myron will comment on this as well. But the comment I would make is that you can think because you've got Metro that you're sort of doing enough, right? And the issue, I think, is that, particularly with regard to economic development strategies, what is essentially a public agency can't really do an economic development strategy. You need to partner up with chambers and the business sector in some kind of way. Now, I'm saying this as somebody who primarily cares about making the business strategy work so you could have development in poor neighborhoods, right? But I think that that's not going to work unless you really have a public-private partnership. Metro has many things that are on its table with regard to land use and transportation and other issues. It's, from what I understand, it hasn't taken on, and you might argue it shouldn't necessarily take on sort of leadership on economic issues, but it certainly could take on partnership, right? I mean, you've got an institution that could partner with sort of private sector actors to define what a regional strategy might be in terms of what kind of industries you want to attract, how you want to attract them. Do you want to make sure that the cluster industries that grow are ones that actually have connections to low-income individuals so that strategic investment isn't limited to sort of enterprise zones, but strategic investment is growing those enterprises which are in fact going to employ people and do the kind of things that Dan was raising. The other thing is the role of the media. In regions where this has worked, Charlotte, the Santa Clara region, et cetera, the media has has come together and sort of begun to educate people about other people who live in the region. And provide a forum for talking about regional efforts and provide a forum for sort of demystifying who the other is, right? You know, I mean, I guess the big thing that I think is, and you know this, if you sit people in a room, if you, I mean, again, I live in California where we like to do legislation by the ballot box, you know? And where we like to do things like pass propositions which declare that people who arrived here without papers are somehow not human beings. And that's a little bit harder to do when you actually live in those communities and know people. And when you sit people down and talk to them and people get to know one another, you begin to have different kinds of relationships. And media can do that at a regional level by getting us to know who the other is. Because fundamentally, as I was saying, there is a deep longing to be connected. We know that the level of alienation we feel from one another is painful. And we know that the politics and economics and everything you do has a spiritual dimension. And I'm not a preacher, it has a spiritual dimension as well as this pragmatic dimension. And I think media can play a very fundamental role in stitching together the social fabric.
I think that you have a very good asset in Metro. You have an elected, accountable regional structure so that you can petition your government in terms of grievances, you can talk to things, you can elect and unelect people based on their performance, and I think that's a definite asset. You also need a discussion at the community level because Metro's function is to set broad rules and set the broad framework. And local communities have to do most of the work internally. And they have to have strong accountability and people going to community meetings and people involved in the future of their neighborhoods. There has to be, people at the grassroots have to be very much involved in making communities work in a long-term livable way. You also have to have a superstructure, which you have to help level the playing field. So you have a nice mix of things.